Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the best and the worst criticisms of psychoanalysis. So what I mean by best is basically the ones I feel that are the more genuine and realistic, and the ones that offer something constructive. What I mean by bad, or the worst I have ever heard, is the ones that really miss the point of it. Like things that are almost out of subject. But I really wanted to do this video because I think that there is a lot of discourse on what psychoanalysis is and what it's not and what it's good for and what is not. So I'm going to start with the best criticisms of psychoanalysis. For me, one of the best criticisms I have ever heard was the fact that it is quite dogmatic. And I must admit that this is quite true. Once you've picked your school, you're supposed to kind of bend the knee and go into the theoretical framework of the school. However, it doesn't mean that this is always the case, or that psychoanalysts individually cannot be creative or basically use many theories. In truth, there is a lot of analysts that are incredibly creative and that break free from the dogma. Problem is, they have to break free from the dogma because a lot of schools still work in a very dogmatic way of having authors that are studied and authors that are rejected. For example, when I was studying psychoanalysis, people like Jung, Adler, to an extent Fernburn, were kind of dismissed because they were seen as traitors or as people that have got it wrong. Therefore, you kind of have to, if you want to, of course, to validate your years, you kind of have to like push those authors aside. So I'm going to say right now that it's not every analyst that's like that during training, or not every healthcare professional is this dogmatic, but there is a lot of dogma involved in psychoanalysis. And that is one of the main criticisms, and one of those that I find is still very prevalent, that there is a lot to be improved in terms of how many authors, how the canon of psychoanalysis works, that an author might be controversial in some schools and not in others. And I think that these questions of transversality, i.e. what we study and the authors, all have something interesting, but a lot of them are often, how can I say, pick sides, and as their students you're implied or you're very much encouraged, if not a bit constrained, to pick the same side. Therefore, people like Jung, Horney, and so on and so forth will not be studied, or at a much lesser extent, or if they are, it's to be criticized by the people. Second good criticism is that often psychoanalysts can be kind of arrogant. So I'm not just talking about a personality trait here, but I'm really talking about they will, for example, if someone does not understand something or someone criticizes them on a level that they feel is beneath them, they will or not even offer an answer, or they will just ridicule the other person. I think that's not okay. Even if the person is critical of psychoanalysis, if they have a question in good faith, then the answer should be in good faith. The fact of using the spitefulness as an answer is not okay, because people have the right to criticize psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis should not be a sacred cow that we protect at all costs. And theory should not be, and this joins back to dogma, should not be something that we basically protect before clinical studies. And often psychoanalysts will use their theory as a shield, and it can be very complicated for those people to let go of the shield and try and reach someone halfway, and to try and make psychoanalysis more available, which will bring us to the next point, which is psychoanalysis has a very specific language. For example, people might have a surface level of what repression, defense mechanisms, penis envy, all of that stuff that people have heard of. They might think that they understand the gist of it, but in truth, it's much more complicated than that. And often psychoanalysts have their own jargon, which prevents a full understanding. And it's something that I've seen even in my comments of people saying, thank you, you've made it more clear and more accessible, which does show that we have a problem on the whole trying to communicate our understandings, our findings. And when we do, and this links to the previous point, we tend to be overly confident about them. Whereas in truth, it's only just a hypothesis, an interesting hypothesis, like I'm not saying anything different, but a hypothesis nevertheless. So very basically, psychoanalysis can be a very closed circle, and you have to get the concepts. And it is, in a way, and this is, I felt it during my studies, a whole perspective on elitism, i.e. if you want to be a psychoanalyst or a clinical psychologist that uses psychoanalysis, you have to be like on top of the game. Like psychoanalysis is the best therapy that can be offered, which is something I disagree with. I don't think there is a best or worst. I just think there are therapies that can provide results, and everyone has a different taste on them, or a different take, or I don't think it's, I can say, one is better than the other, right? I just think it's different. And for psychoanalysts to basically be overly confident and think that their method is the best is also, I think, an act of hubris compared to everything else. And also, it is something that I think draws us further away from other mental health professionals, because we seem to be overly zealot and basically be incredibly arrogant on what we believe and feel is the right answer. The third would be that sometimes we are not explicit enough on the demonstration. What I mean by that is that we might have a clinical case and we will jump directly to, this is a castration anxiety, this is a splitting of personality, and we might not even try and make it more palatable to other people, that we are not basically trying to make it more accessible. We are on the opposite end, trying to make it more complicated, and so more étanche, or more étanche meaning in French that it doesn't communicate, that sins do not seep in. We're trying to make it in a way as a form of distance with others. And lastly, but not least, psychoanalysis as a therapy is expensive. I mean, there's no two ways of saying it. It is true that it can be a very costly process. If you're seeing someone, let's say, 2 to 3 times a week at like €60, it's going to be quite an investment. I'm not saying it's not worth it, quite the opposite, it's great. But we can't avoid the fact that it has a cost, and not everyone can abide by that cost. Other criticisms which I feel are linked is that it is a very demanding therapy, which is true. It's much more demanding than others. And also, it does not provide results maybe as quickly. I think that that's also a good criticism, but that should be always presented to the patient of psychoanalysis is a more long-term, and it's not to be expected to be solving the issue within 2 to 3 sessions, that we're more looking at years rather than months. But I think that all of these things can be talked about and discussed with the patient, something that needs to be done. Now, moving to what I would call the worst criticisms of psychoanalysis. And the very big first one that I want to get out of the way, psychoanalysis is ineffective pseudoscience, which is one that I very commonly hear, not here on YouTube, but a lot in my professional life. And what I always tend to talk about is, well, you know, that it's ineffective is just blatantly untrue. Like, that's just completely unscientific, and interesting enough, and wrong. So psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies have been proven to be effective. There's no true ways around it. People might not want to admit it, but it's just a fact. In the same way that CBT is the golden standard in America is a fact, right? It's the way things are. And people, for them to deny psychoanalysis' effectiveness is more telling about them than it is about psychoanalysis itself. Often people will be, at least what I've found, is either they will stop arguing because they don't have the necessary data on the fact and they just, as I say, parroting something that they've heard, or they will go further by saying that it's been proven to be dismissed. And often when you told them that those studies don't hold in meta-studies, then they often tend to go further and become more aggressive. Because the problem is that psychoanalysis has been intertwined with a cult of personality, that in a way people think that we're still stuck with Freud, that we still think like Freud thought 120 years ago, which is completely wrong, right? I mean, the field has moved so much, so further away than Freud that basically if one was just a pure hardcore Freudian, no other authors, then even in psychoanalysis he would have massive problems because understanding and time has moved on, that has changed the field. And I think that this is also one of the main criticisms that psychoanalysis gets is, oh yeah, but you only think about Freud, or you only think about sex. Again, this is a surface level understanding of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis goes so much deeper than that. It's a whole field, a discipline, in which basically the whole aim is to understand the patient. Also, another interesting critic that I've heard is psychoanalysis isn't objective. And this is one of the strange criticisms because it's not meant to be objective. When you study in the realm of fantasy and of subjectivity, that's not objective. I mean, for example, just the fact that a human can have two emotions that are contradictory for the same person is in of itself unobjective as hell. And you would want this field that tries to study that to be objective because the study of it is subjective. I think that what people mean by that is that, yes, but the fairies are bizarre, which, true, but it's like anything, it's bizarre until you meet people who have those exact fantasies. And when you meet those people on a regular basis, you're like, oh yeah, but that makes sense. Even really outlandish fairies like the paranoid schizoid position of Melanie Klein, which when you first read it, at least I'm talking about my personal experience, maybe you don't have the same, but just as an example, might seem completely like, okay, but how do you even prove that? How do you... But when you're with people who are in a severe state of psychosis, I assure you Melanie Klein really makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're into those processes. And that's what I think people miss, is that psychoanalysis explains so much of that dark inner truth that we shy away on and shy away from, that we are ourselves trying to run away from it because we find it distasteful. And that's what Fernburn points out in his Psychologist, a Prescribed and Proscribed Subject, is that fundamentally we don't want to see that inner world with all its badness. We want to have this superficial understanding of humankind, of this neurological dysfunctionment. But it's not that. That's not just the whole picture. It's also subjective processes and fantasies that create who we are in part. And I think that this talks about how people can have a superficial understanding of psychoanalysis and what it is. Now, on the question of pseudoscience. It always depends on what you call science, right? Because if it's just testing and getting the same result all the time, well, even then, I mean, it's very narrow. And if we take the idea that every human is different, we're never going to get the same result every single time, right? So, I mean, even then it's not that much, that's not a great argument, right? It's kind of missing the point of what psychoanalysis is, which is a methodology to try and help people with their subjectivities. Now, if the question is, could we do it better? Then that's a whole other question, right? But that's never the question. The question that is asked is, this is wrong, it's debased, it's outdated, and so on and so forth. So, another important issue is we only focus on sexuality. Not true. Psychoanalysis has moved on to include relational problems, to include societal problems, cultural problems, and many, many, many others. That psychoanalysis might have a keen eye on sexuality, yes, because this is how we train, but it's not only that. And you'd be hard-pressed to find an analyst that wouldn't, in some way, shape, or form, talk about attachments or about relationships. That would be something that is central now in psychoanalysis, or even Lacan, which has a whole philosophical aspect to it. So no, it's not just about sexuality, and that is very important. And lastly, but perhaps not the least, is this idea that psychoanalysis is outdated or is going to be replaced by a more neurological understanding, and that basically this is like primitive thinking. And I couldn't disagree further from this, because psychoanalysis is not primitive, it's not stupid, it is quite the opposite, very refined. When you really read psychoanalytic texts, there's nothing that is primitive about that, and nothing to which I think neuroscience can take away from. Neuroscience would bring in a new understanding, perhaps even something of a biological understanding of those mechanisms, but those mechanisms are not foolish. Quite the opposite, they're very, very thorough and specific. And even things that have a bad name, like penis envy, are not necessarily wrong. Plenty of people might feel envy, but what is important is to not basically trivialize it. And I think that's the problem with our common framework of reference, is that psychoanalysis has been trivialized and debased in our discourse, both in mental health, but also in the layman's realm, meaning that we are never really talking about basically current psychoanalysis. We're talking about kind of an idea of an idea, right? To basically be a bit of a Platonician, right? We're kind of talking of a copy, which does not necessarily reflect the idea itself. And I think that a lot of people have that copy of a copy of what is supposed to be psychoanalysis, rather than what it truly is. And lastly, to end on this, I'm not trying to say that psychoanalysis is a sacred cow that should not be criticized. Quite the opposite. I do think that criticism is good and valuable, but I do think that there are criticisms that completely miss the point because people are not informed enough or are being of bad faith, and criticisms that are very good, very interesting, and very pertinent. So there is a space for criticism, but perhaps the criticism needs to check itself out before, or to do enough research before really starting to criticize. In a way, I'm going to talk about what Freud used to say, and I'm not a Freudian, right? But I found it very interesting. He said that to really love or hate something, you should know it. And I think there's something to that. You should know psychoanalysis before having a position. And when I mean you should know, it's just you should read one or two books of it. Maybe not the whole collection, right? But something. And make up your mind for yourself. And I'm not saying that psychoanalysis should be the default option or you should love it or anything like that. Of course not. But it's much more subtle, refined, and precise than what people give it credit for. And I find that sort of saddening, right? Because it's not given its fair shot. Anyway, that was my perspective on the best and worst takes in criticisms of psychoanalysis. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have anything you would like to add or any question you would like to ask, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.